Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Kevin Tate. Kevin is the CRO at Rigado. Kevin has been in the business with IoT here at Rigado for quite some number of years. He comes from a history and a background of lots of innovative startups in bringing people through e-commerce and through data science, social media applications. His expertise with Rigado, specifically in IoT, comes from working with over 300 customers and some over 5 million devices that he's been helping them get connected for solutions that encompass everything from smart buildings to smart retail to asset tracking and location. With that, I would like to introduce Kevin Tate. Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Much appreciated. And big crowd today. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate the time. This is a topic that I'm super excited to talk about. It's something we think about a lot here at Rigado. In fact, it's really a foundation of our latest Cascade Edge as a Service offering. So, spoiler alert, this is what I'm going to be talking about over the next 25 minutes or so. First, commercial IoT is different than other IoT segments, and it requires a specific type of edge infrastructure. And we created an Edge as a Service solution to address that particular infrastructure need. And I'd like to share some of what we learned along the way, what led us to that solution in our work with large-scale commercial IoT customers. As many of you signed up for the webinar, quite a few asked for more specifics about the Cascade platform. So I included a couple of slides at the end that talk a little bit more about how that works. We won't go too deep into that, but wanted to share some more specifics about the platform itself. So with that, a little bit about what we do all day here at Rigado. Rigado actually started back in 2010, and our focus has been providing edge connectivity and computing to companies that are building large-scale commercial IoT solutions. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by commercial IoT. And ultimately, we work with companies who are trying to get to market faster and do so with lower cost complexity and risk. Rigado itself is headquartered here in Oregon. We've got offices in DC, London, and Shenzhen. And our journey has taken us to more than 300 global customers and more than 5 million connected devices, primarily in industries like the ones you see on the right: smart buildings, location asset tracking, sensing, and monitoring. And we couldn't do that without our solution partners and our technology platform partners. It has been quite a journey for us, and in large part, what we'll talk about here today is the differences that have emerged from a design perspective and architecture perspective as low-power wireless, particularly Bluetooth, has grown from primarily a consumer IoT set of applications to commercial IoT applications. That's been an accelerating evolution for low-power wireless, and as companies look to put those technologies to work in these new use cases at a very different scale, it requires a different approach, and that different approach is what we've been working on here, and I'll talk with you about today. So, first up, big lesson learned for us is that commercial IoT is different. Different than what? Well, it's different than consumer IoT, and it's different than industrial IoT. And when we talk about consumer IoT, mainly there we're talking about wearables and smart homes and personal monitoring devices. And as all of you know, that's where a lot of the Bluetooth and 802.15.4 wireless protocols got their start. And one of the advantages you have, especially when it comes to Bluetooth applications in consumer, is everybody has a phone. So you can rely on the cell phone as a ubiquitous, secure, application-ready platform that's always connected to the internet. And that's a big head start when you're looking at building and deploying wireless applications and IoT use cases. But it's not necessarily one you have in commercial. And on the other side of the spectrum, commercial IoT is also different than industrial IoT. In industrial IoT, we tend to think of large-scale factory and manufacturing. We think of monitoring utilities expensive assets. A lot of times these are wired connections with expensive hardware and server class devices. The economies of scale are different. The economics are different. The technologies are different. And so we have this thing in the middle, which we call commercial IoT, which behaves in a little bit different way and includes different types of use cases. Specifically, when we talk about commercial IoT, some of the key use cases that we see and that Rigado technologies are deployed to support are things like smart buildings and smart workplaces, connected lighting, asset tracking and sensing and monitoring of all types, location services, so being able to provide contextual experiences to guests in places like hotels and restaurants. This is the set of applications that we're seeing increasingly deployed into environments like these. Commercial office buildings, retail, hotel, hospitality, healthcare facilities, whether those are hospitals or outpatient facilities, entertainment venues. Effectively, these are the new ceilings into which infrastructure is being placed that support these types of key applications. And that landscape is shaping up a little differently than the consumer IoT landscape or the industrial IoT landscape. In particular, some of the forces that we see shaping the market for these types of commercial applications. One is the very rapid growth of short-range wireless devices. So depending on whose staggering projections you believe, the sheer number of devices connected via Bluetooth Low Energy or 802.15.4 is growing from about 5 billion today to about 15 billion by 2022. That's a lot of growth in just 5 years. And at the same time, the need for edge computing, the ability to run local applications, collect data, exert command and control over devices within a relatively short proximity, that's exploding as well. And so those two forces are reshaping the architecture around commercial IoT. And so that creates a particular need. It's a recipe that we'll talk about that includes flexible wireless connectivity, large-scale security, and cost-effective edge computing. And that's not too different from the types of connectivity and computing that you need in, say, commercial or industrial. But what is different is that for commercial applications, you're dealing with a much larger scale. We're often talking about rolling out an asset tracking solution to hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of locations. And the ability to do that, where that means the deployment and installation and monitoring and management and evolution of all those different locations, that's a very different economic proposition. And so figuring out not just how to do this, but how to do it at scale is a big part of the commercial IoT recipe. So what's the right recipe for commercial IoT? Well, the reality is that a lot of what works in consumer IoT is just a little too simple. And as we said before, you can kind of rely on the phone, you can rely on ubiquitous internet and computing capability, and that you don't have that starting infrastructure when you're talking about going into, say, a hospital or a smart workplace. But on the other end of the spectrum, industrial IoT typically is too expensive and complicated. This is an example of an industrial IoT landscape from Cisco and Schneider Electric. It's good for the smart pipeline that they're building. But you can't afford to do this in every restaurant or every school or every hospital room. So how do you find the right balance between capability, cost effectiveness, and scale for commercial IoT? Well, to do that requires a specific type of edge infrastructure, one that is built for these types of commercial IoT applications. And the good news is that most commercial IoT edge architectures look pretty similar. On one end, you've got end devices And that might be, rooms and equipment inside a manufacturing facility or inside a hotel. It might be lighting and controls in the ceiling for a smart lighting assembly, or you might be tracking employees with badges. But ultimately, those things behave in a pretty similar way using connectivity like Bluetooth or 802.15.4. And then on the other end of the spectrum, up in the cloud, you've got cloud services, maybe public cloud, maybe private cloud services that are doing data and analytics and monitoring the performance and managing and updating those devices. And those two poles are pretty similar across architectures. But some of the most interesting stuff happens in the middle, where you've got edge computing gateways that need to do three things over and over again. They need to manage the connectivity to the end devices. They need to control those devices and collect data, run applications, and then integrate with their cloud services at the other end. And so these edge gateways end up playing a very central role in specifically commercial IoT architectures. And that's challenging because they're relatively new, since both consumer and industrial IoT are a little bit more mature and haven't relied on exactly this type of edge computing gateway. A lot of companies are starting from scratch when it comes to creating this type of edge computing infrastructure. But what we see is a fairly common and repeatable recipe for what those gateways need to be. So if we've got these types of applications going into these types of segments, the common edge needs for those gateways, they need to do edge computing, they need to handle wireless connectivity, and they need to handle cloud integration. So seeing that as a repeatable set of needs across these types of use cases, Rigado set out a couple of years ago to figure out how do we create a secure and scalable and cost-effective solution for that particular recipe. And part of what we saw in working with companies on this edge gateway infrastructure is that most companies were trying to do it themselves. And the ones that were typically starting in one of two places. Either they were starting with a Raspberry Pi, which makes a ton of sense. It's cheap, it's easy to program, it does a lot of what you need out of the box for prototyping. But the issue is you can't go to market, you can't scale securely with Raspberry Pis. So they would get their prototype done, but it didn't necessarily get them any closer to production and the ability to roll out to thousands or tens of thousands of locations in a secure and scalable infrastructure. On the other end of the spectrum, we saw companies, and a lot of times these were companies coming from industrial IoT or systems integrators. They would start with whatever industrial IoT server they'd used on their last project, which is plenty of horsepower. But the reality here is that it's just too expensive. You can't afford a $2,000 server and all its infrastructure and management costs for, again, every conference room or every hotel room or every hospital room. So it doesn't necessarily get companies closer to production because it's too expensive. So when we created the IoT gateways that are central to this infrastructure, we tried to do so with the right mix of edge connectivity and computing specifically for these types of commercial IoT infrastructures. And so some examples of where our gateways found success in different types of use cases over the past couple of years. One example is cold chain logistics. So in this case for vaccines, being able to ride along with vaccines with the temperature monitors and make sure in real time that vaccines have stayed within the acceptable range and are still safe to give to patients. Great example of edge computing and connectivity for a gateway like this. Another very common example is asset tracking. So we see a lot of companies who want to use Bluetooth Low Energy or mesh or Wi-Fi or a combination to do asset tracking within a warehouse setting or a factory setting. And again, great job for this type of gateway to collect that data, run a local application, and then get data back up to the cloud. And then smart workplaces have been very popular. The ability to control lighting, sense which rooms are occupied, integrate with scheduling, send data back around usage and workplace utilization, so you can optimize the workplace. Great example of this type of an edge infrastructure. So we were fortunate to work with a ton of companies over the last 2 years in rolling out these gateways at scale, and getting a sense for what it takes to manage this type of edge infrastructure. And what that gave us was a perspective not just on the technology required, but also what does it feel like to do this from a business perspective? So we talked about the technology side already. You need the connectivity, the computing, and the integration. But from a business perspective, you've also got to create an edge infrastructure that is secure and that's scalable and that's cost-effective. And the cost-effective part a lot of times comes down to having the right total cost of ownership over the lifetime of this edge infrastructure. And so that's a little bit different lens on the goals and role of the gateways and the IoT infrastructure itself than just the technology. And so to give an example of that, one of the customers that we worked with provides location services for hospitality in restaurants. And in this case, there's typically 4 or 5 Rigado gateways that go into each location. And we're fortunate to have a very successful deployment there. They're in more than 10,000 locations and growing. But 5 gateways times more than 10,000 locations means that they've got more than 50,000 gateways that need to be shipped to the location, installed, monitored, kept updated and secure over time, even as their applications go through revisions and get smarter, and they make available new features for that client. And that gave us a real sense for the business challenges of iterating and operating this type of edge infrastructure on a global scale when you've got tens of thousands of locations. And one of the things that we saw companies particularly challenged to build out on their own was security. And part of that's because security isn't something that can be addressed just at the last minute when it comes to edge infrastructure. It really requires an integrated approach that starts at the point of manufacture. You've got to be able to sign these gateways in a way that they can be authenticated, and you can validate all updates once they're in the field. You're going to need hardware and software-based elements of security, like a secure operating system, an encrypted file system. You're going to need applications running in secure containers so that you can be sure that they don't have access to data that they shouldn't. And then you've got to keep these gateways secured even as new exploits come out. There were almost 1,800 new security vulnerabilities or confirmed vulnerabilities and exploits identified in June 2018, and keeping track of which of those apply to what versions of software and which connection libraries and which of those need to be applied is no small task. So we really saw security in particular as an area where companies were challenged to develop and maintain an edge infrastructure at scale. So all that taught us a lot. And what we had learned from customers who were deploying programmable gateways at scale informed our design of Cascade, which is the integrated edge as a service solution that we launched last month. Specifically, we set out to solve the whole problem that IoT teams were struggling with in trying to create their own edge infrastructure. And so to zoom in on that a little bit, we saw developers who were starting often with, say, a Yocto-based programmable gateway, really having to spend a lot of time figuring out what their Edge OS is going to include, how to build up and maintain that Yocto environment, how to secure it, and then on the operations side, how to develop monitoring and updating tools to patch applications or iterate applications within that environment, how to keep things encrypted and secure even as those updates are made, and then, as we talked about before, coming up with an end-to-end security approach that spans hardware, software, and then, of course, the installation and maintenance of the devices. And so the net result was that IoT teams who were typically most excited about the application they were creating or the data that they were going to be able to gather and help their companies apply to their business were spending a whole bunch of time and money just trying to create and manage the infrastructure required. And ultimately, that's not the most differentiated or strategic thing they're building. And what we heard from those teams is, I'd rather have a secure and scalable edge infrastructure that I can deploy on so I can just add my app. And so that's why we created Cascade Edge as a Service. So what is Cascade? So Cascade takes the gateway and surrounds it with a secure computing platform, Edge Connect, a performance monitoring and update management toolset, Edge Direct, and then an end-to-end security infrastructure called Edge Protect. And that forms a foundation, an infrastructure onto which customers can deploy their individual applications. So let me talk a little bit more about how that works. So the gateway itself is an updated version of our gateway from last year. It's got a bit more edge computing power with an 800 megahertz RMA7, half a gig of RAM and 8 gigs of storage. Importantly, it's now running Ubuntu Core, which I'll talk about more in a minute, a containerized operating system that's optimized for edge applications. We've also boosted the connectivity side. This now has full Bluetooth 5 capability, including a power amplifier and an LNA. We're using the latest Nordic nRF52 840, if you're familiar with that chip. And that includes also 802.15.4 for Zigbee and Thread. And we also support our partners WirePass with their mesh capabilities on the gateway. On the security side, our end-to-end approach includes a secure element hardware module, as well as the encrypted file system and secure boot. And those are really important aspects that you want on your gateways deployed in the field. And then finally, we're now offering worldwide LTE support. We have Cat 1 options available in samples now and coming out in production later this summer. So that's the hardware side. But what's new on the software side? So the biggest difference here is we now use the Ubuntu Core operating system as the basis for a containerized edge platform. So on top of the board support package and radio support libraries, we have Canonical's core operating system, including the secure boot and the operating system itself. Then we have the drivers that we provide for things like the Edge Direct monitoring, key management for cloud providers, and cloud integration. And we're also developing a set of APIs that make it easier to connect to common wireless devices like Bluetooth beacons. So that, for example, if you are just gathering data from Bluetooth devices in advertising mode, you don't have to know anything about those Bluetooth profiles or their GAP profiles. You can actually hit those devices through a RESTful web-style API and pull that data directly into your application. And all those applications are running in containers, and those are deployed through Edge Direct, which I'll show you in a minute. But important to note, you can run multiple applications in multiple containers on a single gateway. So a lot of our clients are starting with, say, a smart lighting application, but once they are deployed in their customers' ceilings, they want to be able to offer things like environmental monitoring or safety features or maintenance monitoring, and they can deploy those applications to their gateways and run them side by side, leveraging the same device connectivity. Now, the way they deploy those are through something we call Edge Direct. So this is a cloud-based service that includes first a set of edge performance monitoring tools, so things like CPU and disk and bandwidth for all of the gateways that are in the field. It makes it easy to see and report on how things are scaling. We can also build alerts and with things like PagerDuty so that you know if you're running into scale or disk issues. That's also available through an API, so a lot of our customers will take that information or the log files that are created and pull that into their larger monitoring infrastructure. And then on the update side, Edge Direct provides a DevOps-style update orchestration capability, which allows you to upload multiple versions of your application, assign those to channels like development or beta or stable, and then push those to gateways according to a tagging system, making it possible to manage literally applications across tens of thousands of gateways where those might need to be different according to location or version or use case. So Edge Direct gives a robust tool set for the monitoring, the orchestration. And then on the security side, Edge Protect mirrors that approach we talked about earlier, an end-to-end approach that starts at the point of manufacture with secure IDs and encrypted keys, that uses Edge Direct for verification of updates, making sure that what's running on the gateway is what's supposed to be running. Everything that is running on the gateway is in those secure containers with limited access to available resources on an encrypted OS and file system. And then we're also pushing updates or making them available as new exploits or vulnerabilities are discovered. So that's a part of the Cascade service is our publishing of updates for you to make available to your gateways, so you don't have to be tracking all 1,800 exploits per month that you need to be aware of out in the field. So we think there are some real benefits to providing this as a service that includes not just the gateway, but also the software platform and tools around it. A primary one is the ability to get those security updates as soon as they're available. The fact that you don't have to create your own performance management and monitoring and orchestration tools is a big benefit. Because we are providing these devices as an Edge as a service subscription, they're always under warranty. So if you have any issues with devices in the field, Rigado will replace those. And then we also offer a hardware refresh option. So recognizing that this is fast-moving technology, if you're under, say, a 3-year subscription for the Edge infrastructure, you'd be eligible to get the latest and greatest version of the gateway hardware after the 3-year subscription is up. And I talked a bit about total cost of ownership. I talked about the business view of commercial IoT, and I want to round back to that for a minute. What we learned in working with our commercial IoT customers is that they are often taking to market their solution on an as-a-service basis or on a subscription basis. So if it's a smart workplace customer, they might be looking at charging, per square foot per month, or an asset tracking customer might be doing it based on the number of locations or the number of assets tracked. And so they were saying to us, it doesn't align well with the business they're building for us to be charging up front for the hardware. Ultimately, it becomes a big CapEx for them to buy gateways as they are not necessarily sure of their timing and plan for rollout. So we offer Cascade as a monthly subscription. So both the gateway hardware and the secure operating system, cloud-based tools, and end-to-end security all come as a simple subscription service, which companies can subscribe to on a monthly or an annual basis. And what we're finding is that is makes it easier for our customers to deploy on the Rigado Edge infrastructure and then scale as needed, both as they roll out to new locations and as they add new applications to extend the capability and the functionality of the gateways that they have in the field. So that's how we created Cascade and what some of the lessons that we learned along the way. With that, let me open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Kevin. We appreciate your presentation. Thanks for the time today. We hope everybody enjoyed that. There are a few questions that came in. And so once again, as a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat box there to send those questions in. And we'll get started with the first few here. So which protocol, Kevin, it says, do you see being most used in commercial IoT?
Well, a lot of what we see today is Bluetooth Low Energy. There's a lot of excitement around Bluetooth 5 and some of the mesh capabilities that were announced late last year. I think part of that is because for things like asset tracking, where, say, RFID has been the technology of choice for a long time, some of the things you can now do with Bluetooth Low Energy seem to have much better economics, right? Much more cost effective to do things like asset tracking or monitoring. I would also say we see a lot of excitement around mesh, so not just Bluetooth mesh, but also the kind of mesh opportunities that something like Thread offers. And so we've been very involved with not just the Bluetooth SIG, but also the Thread members committee as that evolves too.
Fantastic, thank you. Next question, so Cascade supports full Zigbee 3.0 now, question mark?
It does. So we have hardware and software support for Zigbee 3.0. As you probably know, Zigbee implementations can be relatively specific, right, as companies develop their own profiles and applications. So we and our partners can work with companies on their specific Zigbee implementation.
Next question here is, what bandwidth, i.e. bandwidth or data throughput, does the gateway have between the BTLE and the Ethernet backend? Typically, the BTLE module is connected with a serial interface, which is slow.
Well, you're probably getting past my technical depth there, but I do know there are a few different interfaces, including HCI and serial BLE, as you mentioned, that we can use between the processor and the BLE stack. I'd say one of the advantages that Cascade gives is while we can offer sort of abstracted API-based access to the connectivity, like the IoT APIs I mentioned earlier, we can also offer lower level access to let people go directly to the radios from their containerized application. So that offers more flexibility.
Fantastic, thank you for that. Next question here, so you may have already answered this, but the question was, you mentioned one kind of mesh, I think, but does mesh fit in commercial IoT solutions?
We see a lot of interest in mesh. As folks probably know, mesh right now is not particularly battery optimized when you look at something like Bluetooth mesh. So it makes a ton of sense for, say, smart lighting, where you've got mains power, but it's still evolving when it comes to some of the sleepy modes or the ability to conserve battery life when you've got things running on a coin cell. So we're very bullish on mesh, but I think there's an opportunity to innovate there over the next year or two as it expands beyond smart lighting.
Okay, next one here. As we know, usual IoT devices are expected to stay live in consumer commercial areas for 10 plus years. How the support organization set up for Rigado? How are we going to handle the multi-year battery situation, it sounds like?
Yeah. Well, so there's two pieces there. So one is the edge infrastructure side and the gateways themselves. And they're absolutely right. Usually we're looking at a 7-10 year horizon for the infrastructure going into, say, a hospital or a workplace. That said, we also recognize that companies may want to rev that hardware. So they may want to update not just the applications, but the actual physical hardware as improvements are made to radios or new protocols. So that's part of why we include a hardware refresh option as a part of our subscription. That may not make sense for some customers who just want to leave it there because it's not in a place that makes sense to go in and update the hardware. But for other applications, it may make sense to look at new versions of that hardware every, say, 3 to 5 years. Then the other point to your last question is around the battery. And so really making sure that battery life is optimized around especially something like a proximity sensor or a monitoring beacon. That's super important. So part of what we work with customers on is testing whether those are coin cell based or things that are going into a conference room and need to last 5 to 7 years. It's not uncommon to have that as a requirement.
Fantastic. This next one sounds technical, but
I'll
do my best.
All right, bring it.
See how it works. If WirePass supports the Enocean SEPF powered BLE light switches in their mesh, can those be pulled into Cascade?
Yes, I believe is the answer there. So we work very closely with WirePass, and we have full WirePass support on both the Cascade gateway and on our relatively new NRF52840 module. And so I believe the answer would be if WirePass supports it, we can support it both on our gateway and the modules.
Fantastic. Next question, will you be offering Cellular as a service too? If so, do you have pricing structures for this yet?
Oh, good question. So, so far, our intent is not to get in the way of our customers' cellular agreements. So another way of saying that is we don't plan to become an MVNO and resell connectivity. The customers we're working with today tend to have existing cellular arrangements, and so they want to be able to basically insert their SIM card and go. That said, we're looking at offering some kind of basic cellular capability as a part of our dev kits so that you have something you can get up and running with for prototyping purposes.
Okay, fantastic. Next question. What use cases are you seeing for cellular Cat 1 LTE connectivity using Cascade? Is this a ramp, or what percentage of the 15B projected growth
is coming from cellular?
Yeah.
Well, so the short answer is yeah. We're seeing a ton of interest in LTE. To put it in some buckets, one is if, let's say you're going into a restaurant chain and you're doing something like guest experiences or asset tracking there. If it's tricky to rely on what the Wi-Fi situation might be in a given location, or whether or not you'll have power over Ethernet available. And so especially if you've got, say, a large franchisee organization, providers are looking at, can I just use cellular? That way I can take something out of the box, it's already connected, put the beacons where they need to go, and I'm up and running. So there's a big cost savings when it comes to this sort of complexity and uncertainty of deployment. Of course, that comes with typically a cost on the back end of using LTE as your primary backhaul for internet. The other big cluster of LTE demand, I'd say, is for disconnected or remote environments, right? So if we're monitoring assets on container ships, or we want to be able to track equipment as it's used on a work site, that's not somewhere you're going to have wires or existing Wi-Fi infrastructure. So LTE becomes the primary backhaul there too.
Fantastic, thank you. Next one here, how should companies be thinking about measuring business value or return on investment with the kinds of IoT use cases and infrastructure you've talked about here?
So I'd say two buckets. The bucket that comes to mind first around IoT is often cost savings, right? So when we look at tracking assets or monitoring energy, a lot of that comes down to efficiency and cost savings. I will say one of the often a good example of a use case and ROI for IoT is anywhere you see a person walking around with a clipboard, there might be an opportunity to use a connected solution instead. The other area, though, which I think is more unique to commercial IoT and in some ways more thought-provoking, is ROI linked to creating new business value, right? So I talked about that example around restaurants and providing table delivery service at restaurants. The metrics around something like that are linked to happier customers who stay longer, who order more, who have faster turnover and throughput. And all those things are about driving the top line, as is something like a connected workplace, where you're looking for happier or more productive employees who get more done. And so I think there's a whole interesting ROI case around revenue driving opportunities and connected guest experiences that's driving commercial IoT as well as the cost savings.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next question here is around LoRa. Does Rigado's gateway support LoRa?
It does not today, but we've gotten a lot of questions about LoRa. The longer answer is that we have an expansion port available on the gateway, which we can use to put a LoRa modem inside the case and provide an integrated solution. We've spec'd that out. We're ready to do that. But we haven't quite seen the use case that drives the LoRa adoption for us yet. I think that's because a lot of our commercial IoT cases are still indoors and not necessarily long range. But I think we may see that change as we get more into the LTE capability and we spend more time outdoors.
Fantastic. Next question here: are you considering repackaging into a smaller form factor for customers who need one?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, the gateway today is about 4.5 by 4.5 inches. We've talked about a smaller option that's more focused just on connectivity for something like a hotel room. We basically just need a conduit, but it's not something that's on our roadmap today.
Okay. Which low-power wireless technology is driving the industry the most and works best with Rigado?
Well, similar I was saying before, we're big fans of Bluetooth Low Energy, and I think Bluetooth 5 in particular has raised a lot of eyebrows when it comes to more commercial applications. As the mesh capabilities come along, as people start putting the new long-range, higher data rates and extended advertising to work, I think we're going to see Bluetooth kind of extend its ubiquity, not just with consumers, but also in this commercial IoT range.
Okay, thanks so much. Next question here is, do you have any gateways that are mobile, like in your cold chain example?
Yeah, so the new LTE-enabled gateways would probably be the best example of that. And we have Cat 1 LTE options both for US and for worldwide.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think they may have meant mobile as in moving. The gateway's moving.
Oh, like a battery power option? Maybe. Yep, we have that can be done as well. It's a 5-volt. It's a 5-volt power supply. So we've certainly had customers who designed in battery and rechargeable battery options. Some of that comes down to custom cases, and so you can see the standard case we offer, which by the way, can be white labeled. It can feature custom branding, but it's mainly meant for an indoor installation. Something you put on a wall or a ceiling. That said, we do have outdoor enclosures available, both waterproof IP67 and then more sort of weatherproof, dustproof cases, and those can include battery options.
Well, fantastic. I think we're getting close to the end here. Looks like one more question came in. As larger applications and computing requirements get pushed to the edge, does Rigado see a path to a more powerful edge gateway?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. We certainly are looking at a gateway that has more dual core processing capability, and I would say particularly for sort of hybrid infrastructures where you might have a gateway like the Cascade gateway in every, say, hotel room, but you need something that's at the end of the hall or on each floor that can handle things more like real-time video processing, or developing, not just implementing algorithms. And so part of what we're learning from our customers is where does the heavy lifting need to happen at the edge versus where does a more edge processing gateway, implementing Lambda functions or gathering data or running, basic data processing. So stay tuned.
Fantastic. That is all our time today. We really appreciate you all for joining. As a reminder, we will have a recording of this webinar, and we will send out a link to that by the end of the week. So if you want to review something you heard today, certainly that will be available to you. We'll also be sending it to people who may have missed us today. So if you have a colleague or someone who you think would benefit from this, you can forward that link to them. We're going to have more of these coming up in the near future, so please look for announcements from Rigado about future webinars, and we certainly appreciate you joining us today. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.